Last Wednesday was an important day. It marked the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968. I was a mere 10 years old at the time, and I still remember the announcement being made during the evening news, broadcast by, of course, Walter Cronkite, who it seemed like in those days was the one who delivered most of the bad news that we heard about, and there was quite a bit of it to go around back then. What I knew about Dr. King at that young age was that basically he was trying to resolve a great injustice in our country, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to kill him. Just like I couldn't imagine back then in 1968 why black people couldn't live in whatever neighborhood they wanted to, which was still a major unresolved issue back then. The adult world was very confusing to me. I was in 5th grade at the time, and that was when, at least back then, we were just learning the truth about slavery and the Civil War, and of course segregation and everything that followed, the Emancipation Proclamation, the importance of Lincoln and things like that. And learning about all of that was like the beginning of the end of innocence for me. I never looked at the USA the same way again. There had been this monstrous institutionalized evil in the land which proudly proclaimed that all men are created equal. And there was this dissonance that was created by that realization that's been with me ever since. And 50 years later, we're still having to deal with the karmic effects of all of that, but things have improved remarkably. And Dr. King even said the same thing. He was a realist, so he was able to acknowledge that progress had been made. Back in 1964, he had received the Nobel Peace Prize, and during the speech where he accepted it, he outlined the significant advances that had been made, not just in this country, but worldwide. He started by pointing out that in 1934, there were only 3 independent nations in the whole of Africa. By 1964, 35 independent African nations had escaped colonialism. Slavery was ended there, and there was a gradual decline in segregation here. There had been strides that had been made. Voting rights for African Americans had been protected. Civil rights acts had been passed. There was much to celebrate. And yet, at the same time, you go to South Africa, and government-enforced segregation there didn't end until 1991. In this country, and this was the thing that surprised me, I didn't learn about this until many years later, in 1967, it was still illegal for black and white people to get married in 16 states here. And in some places it was a felony. It was an actual felony. It took a Supreme Court decision that year, 1967, to force the repeal of the laws in those last 16 states. So what I want to focus on today, 50 years later, is the philosophy and the action plan that Dr. King used to accomplish what he did, which was tremendous. And the title that I chose for today, Darkness Cannot Drive Out Darkness, comes from a book that he wrote in 1963. The book was called Strength to Love. And here's the quote that it comes from. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. I had always thought that Dr. King was the organizer and the leader of the civil rights movement, but the truth is that he was initially chosen to be the spokesperson for this movement. And after that, he became the de facto leader and the face of the movement. And we can see why they wanted him to be the spokesman. Because he was a gifted and powerful speaker. We hear about his spoken word speeches. They call the I Had a Dream speech one of the greatest in history. And yet his written words are eloquent and powerful as well. I mean, he had the whole package. Well, Dr. King began to formulate his philosophy and practice of nonviolence all the way back in 1958. He wrote an essay called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And he said that it all started when he was reading Henry David Thoreau, who was discussing civil disobedience and the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil, oppressive, or domination system. And of course, as a Christian minister, he was also familiar with the teachings of Jesus about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek and so on and so forth. But this is what I really found interesting. He had serious doubts about the practicality of doing that in situations that involve racial groups and nations. So he was familiar with the teachings of Jesus, but he was very skeptical about whether it would work. He actually wrote using these words. He said, "During this period, I had almost despaired of the power of love in solving social problems." I had almost despaired of the power of love in solving social problems. And what changed it all for him was when he started reading the works of Mohandas Gandhi. That's when it all started coming together for him. And it turns out it was really Hindu philosophy or a Hindu influence that set him on the path to his policy of nonviolent resistance. Here's how he describes his great awakening. He said, the whole Gandhian concept of satyagraha, which is truth force or love force, was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished. And I came to see for the first time that the Christian doctrine of love operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method. That's an interfaith approach, if I ever heard one. And yet we don't hear about that, do we? We don't hear about how it was this combination of the two things that made it so powerful. And all of this really fits in quite well with something we've been talking about during the Easter season called delusional assumptions. If you'll recall, the idea comes from this other book called Engaging the Powers by theologian Walter Wink. He says that a part of what Jesus was trying to do was to set us free from delusional assumptions, or we can call them crazy ideas, that we've swallowed without much thought and allowed to become ingrained in our consciousness and our culture. And one of those crazy ideas or delusional assumptions is the same thing that Dr. King was opposing, which is the idea that violence is good. Violence is redemptive. Walter Wink has a term for it. He calls it the myth of redemptive violence. This crazy idea, this delusional assumption that violence can save the day, that violence is always an acceptable solution, and perhaps even the first and only solution to what ails us. And this myth, it's insidious because it gets planted in consciousness during childhood, and then it gets reinforced in countless ways. And it's not just about video games. Although they're a popular target today, the problem has been around for much longer than we've had video games. Walter Wink used this example, which I have to say hit close to home for me, because when I was a child, one of my cartoon heroes was Popeye the Sailor Man, this guy right here. Anybody remember the Popeye cartoons? They were on all the time. They started back in the 1920s in black and white, and I watched them from the time I was old enough to watch TV until, finally, I can't remember the last time I watched one. I think I watched one on YouTube not too long ago, actually, but a little nostalgia. And every single one of the hundreds of episodes had the same dang basic plot. The typical plot has this guy named Bluto, representing evil, the villain, who is menacing Popeye's girlfriend, Olive Oil, over there, which raises a whole nother set of stereotypes that we don't need to get into today. But for the whole show, Popeye is on the losing end of every single encounter. Evil, in the form of Bluto, is about to prevail. And there he is. He's got Popeye in his clutches, and he's got his trusty can of spinach there hanging out the back pocket, right? We all know what's going to happen next, because in the nick of time, Popeye finds his can of spinach where he gets the strength to beat Bluto into a bloody pulp. Like this one here, spinach in one hand, and with the other hand he is knocking Bluto out of his shoes with a mighty clunk. Nobody ever learns anything from these encounters. Bluto never stops treating Olive as an object. Nobody ever decides, maybe, let's sit down and talk about our differences. Bluto never seems to figure out that Popeye has a can of spinach somewhere up his sleeve. And Popeye never learns to eat the damn spinach at the beginning of the episode, right? And it's not like we're just picking on poor Popeye here, because this same plot, or a variation on it, shows up in a long list of kids shows, adult shows, movies, TV dramas, both new and old, and yes, it also shows up in video games. So, we watch this, starting at a young, impressionable age, and we get a couple of messages that are part of this myth of redemptive violence. One message is that, again, the first, the best, the only solution and response to the problem of violence is more violence. Another message we get is that there's no price to be paid for the use of violence. At the end of the cartoon, everyone lives happily ever after, and then they come back the next day to repeat the entire dysfunctional cycle over again. In the words of Dr. King, we are seeing the descending spiral of destruction that just keeps repeating itself. No one questions it. It becomes that basic delusional assumption, and we must question it. That's what Dr. King was trying to get the world to do. The hard part is trying to go against something that's become embedded at the level of consciousness, or I should probably say subconsciousness, because most of the time we don't even know that it's there doing its thing. Now, this doesn't mean that we go on a crusade to ban Popeye cartoons and the like. In fact, we can actually use these things, like we're doing this morning, as a springboard for questioning the underlying assumptions. You don't try to ban an idea or destroy an idea or an assumption, because that's just another form of violence. The best way to deal with a bad or dysfunctional idea is to offer a better one. I want us to be better equipped to talk about these things with our children, our friends, families, neighbors. That's what it's going to take, is to get the better idea out there. Another point here is that this isn't pacifism. Sometimes the reasonable and ethical response to aggression is to use sufficient force to oppose it. Standing by and doing nothing during the Holocaust would have been immoral. But the key words here are reasonable and ethical, not emotional and ideological, and certainly not vengeful. So Gandhi and Dr. King both had the rare opportunity to test nonviolence in situations that involved, admittedly, great suffering and great oppression, but there wasn't the threat of genocide. But what they did was that they proved that nonviolence is effective. I mean, how else could an unarmed minority manage to accomplish their objectives against a far more powerful group, and a group that was better armed in so many different ways. I recall watching the national news in those days, seeing the coverage of unarmed marchers being knocked down with clubs, blasted with fire hoses, attacked by dogs, tear gassed. We heard the story of the 4 young girls that died when a bomb was planted in their church, people being shot. Dr. King said that one of the purposes of nonviolence was to awaken a sense of moral shame, which is how I felt as I watched that on TV. I was ashamed that this was going on in the land of the free. And recently I saw some newspaper photos of another demonstration that may not have gotten quite as much coverage, but it was this one here. Those were known as the lunch counter sit-ins that happened primarily in Greensboro, North Carolina. Some students, both white and African Americans, would sit in an area of the lunch counter reserved for white people. And in this photo we can see the young white people behind the demonstrators who were sitting in. What they had done was they committed the great crime, of course, of sitting in a whites-only area and expecting to be served. So these other people are behind them. And what they're doing is they are pouring sugar, coffee, milkshakes, anything they can get their hands on from the counter on the demonstrators. Some of them were burning them with cigarettes as they sat there. And they know they're being photographed. They know they're being photographed and they don't care. And I remember thinking to myself about how there were all these different civil rights laws that were passed a few years after this happened, which put an end to that kind of discrimination. You could sit at a lunch counter now without something like this happening, but I wondered what happened to the people that were doing the pouring and the burning in those photos. Did the passage of those laws suddenly cause a change of heart and mind? Did the mere passage of laws cause change at the level of consciousness? Or did they simply go underground? Or perhaps a better metaphor would be, did they perhaps crawl under a rock to hide and bide their time? You look at the ages of the people in those photographs and you know that some of them are still around. Well, that's a question that I'll leave for us to ponder, especially when we hear some folks saying that we are a post-racial society. I know what Dr. King would say, not because I can predict those things, but because he already said it. He would say, we need to stay awake. Here's what he wrote. One of the great liabilities of history is that all too many people fail to remain awake through great periods of social change. Every society has its protectors of the status quo and its fraternities of the indifferent, who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions. Today, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake. Stay awake, and if I might dare add something to his words, stay awake and question our delusional assumptions. Thanks, Dr. King. See you next week.